Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to Lotus Light Teachings. Today, we're going to explore a topic that touches the heart of many, living joyfully alone, the Buddhist path to inner freedom in old age. Have you ever wondered why some people find peace in solitude, while others fear it? Imagine a monk sitting by a quiet river, watching the sunset, perfectly content in his own company. No longing for approval, no fear of loneliness. Just stillness and deep joy. What if solitude is not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced? What if, instead of feeling like we are losing something, we are actually gaining the most precious thing of all, ourselves? In today's discussion, we'll redefine what it means to be alone and uncover the Buddhist wisdom that can help us not just accept solitude, but truly thrive in it. Whether you're someone who is adjusting to a quieter life, preparing for the years ahead, or simply looking to deepen your connection with yourself, this message is for you. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's embark on this journey together. There is a story told in Buddhist tradition about a great master who, in his final years, withdrew into the mountains. When his students asked why, he simply smiled and said, "A river does not regret the sea waiting for it. It flows, it carries, it lets go. And in doing so, it finds its peace." Life, like a river, is always flowing. In our youth, we are full of movement, seeking, striving, holding on. We define ourselves through relationships, achievements, and connections. But as we age, the river begins to slow. The currents that once carried us so fast now invite us to pause, to reflect, and to simply be. Yet so many of us fear this change. We fear solitude, thinking it means isolation. We think we must cling to relationships, to the past, to the world we once knew. But Buddhism teaches us that true peace comes not from how many people surround us, but from how deeply we connect with ourselves. So here is the question. What if aging is not about losing the life we had, but about discovering the life we never fully lived? That is what we will explore today. The path of solitude, not as a loss, but as a doorway to inner freedom. In many cultures, getting older is seen as a time of loss. Fewer social gatherings, fewer friends, a quieter home. But Buddhism offers us a different perspective. Aging is a season of personal liberation. Let's take a moment to reflect on the story of Mr. Tanaka, a retired businessman in Japan. For years, he lived a fast-paced life, networking, attending events, always surrounded by people. But when retirement came, many of his social connections faded. At first, he struggled with loneliness. But then, something changed. One morning, he woke up early, made himself a cup of green tea, and sat quietly by the window. For the first time in years, he truly noticed the morning light, the sound of birds, the warmth of the tea in his hands. In that moment, he realized he had spent so much time chasing life that he had forgotten how to simply experience it. And so he embraced a new rhythm. Long walks instead of long meetings. Moments of stillness instead of endless conversations. Solitude, he realized, was not loneliness. It was freedom. One of the most powerful lessons of aging is that relationships, like everything else in life, are impermanent. Friendships change. People come and go. But rather than mourning what fades, we can celebrate what remains. Buddhism teaches that true connection is not about how many people we have in our lives, but about the depth of the connections we nurture. Imagine two different scenarios. Scenario 1. You have a cup of tea with a dear friend. You speak little, but everything you say is felt deeply. Scenario 2. You attend a large gathering. You speak to many people, but leave feeling empty. Which experience brings more fulfillment? In Zen practice, there is a saying, "When drinking tea, just drink tea." It means to be fully present in what you do, and this applies to relationships as well. Rather than spreading ourselves thin, we can choose to invest in the connections that truly nourish us. One of the greatest Buddhist teachings is self-reliance. The Buddha himself left behind a life of privilege, walked alone into the forest, and discovered enlightenment. This does not mean we must isolate ourselves. It means that our peace should not depend on anything external. Not on approval, not on constant companionship, not on distraction. Think of a tree standing alone in a vast field. It does not ask for company. It does not fear the open space around it. It simply stands, grows, and exists in harmony with the world. In solitude, we too can learn to stand strong. The Zen artist Li Wei once said, "When I was young, I feared being alone. But in my solitude, I found my greatest masterpiece, peace within myself." As we reach the end of this reflection, I invite you to sit with one final thought. If you were to spend the next year in complete solitude, how would you experience it? Would it feel like loneliness, or would it feel like an opportunity to truly meet yourself? Aging is not about losing something. It is about gaining clarity, wisdom, and freedom. It is an invitation to finally live without masks, without expectations, without noise. To wake up in the morning and listen, not to the world outside, but to the quiet voice within. The shift in priorities, from seeking belonging to seeking peace. I remember the first time I sat alone in a cafe, truly alone, not waiting for someone, not pretending to be busy, just being. At first, it felt unnatural, almost awkward. My fingers twitched toward my phone. My mind searched for an escape. But then, as I sipped my coffee and let the world hum around me, something shifted. I noticed the warmth of the cup in my hands, the way the light danced through the window, the rhythm of my own breath. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. It's strange how we spend so much of our lives chasing connection, yet the most profound moments often come in solitude. When we're young, we measure ourselves by how many people surround us. The more friends we have, the more parties we attend, the more invitations we receive, the more alive we must be, right? But then life happens. People drift away. The invitations slow. And suddenly, we are faced with a terrifying question. Who am I when no one is watching? For Mr. Tanaka, that question came later in life. A successful businessman in Japan, he built his world around people. Meetings, colleagues, friends who filled his calendar. His identity was woven into the roles he played. The respected executive, the generous host, the loyal friend. But when retirement came, so did the silence. The phone calls became less frequent. The bustling dinners turned into quiet evenings at home. And in that emptiness, he felt lost. At first, he fought it. He tried to fill the void with distractions, joining clubs, making small talk with neighbors, keeping the TV on just to hear another voice. But no matter how much noise he surrounded himself with, the loneliness remained. Then one morning, something changed. He woke early, made himself a simple cup of tea, and instead of rushing to check his messages, he just sat. He listened to the wind rustling through the trees outside. He noticed the gentle rise and fall of his own breath. And for the first time, he felt something unexpected, a quiet joy. It was in that stillness that he realized something profound. His entire life, he had sought validation from others. He had measured his worth by his connections, his influence, the way people responded to him. But now, in the absence of all that, he found a new kind of fulfillment. One that did not depend on anyone else. He found himself. There's a reason why so many spiritual traditions speak of solitude as a path to enlightenment. The Buddha himself left behind the palace, the wealth, the people, and retreated into the forest. Jesus sought the wilderness. Great thinkers, poets, and sages have all understood that to truly know oneself, one must first sit alone with oneself. Yet, modern life has conditioned us to fear solitude. We equate it with loneliness, as if being alone means being unwanted. But there's a difference. Loneliness is the absence of connection, while solitude is the presence of the self. Think of Maya Angelou, who once said, "I belong everywhere and nowhere, which is rather how I've lived my life." She understood that true belonging is not about being surrounded by people, but about feeling at home within oneself. She didn't need a crowd to affirm her worth. She was the source of her own strength. For years, I believed that the more people I had around me, the more complete I would feel. I clung to friendships that had long since faded, stayed in rooms where I no longer belonged, just to avoid facing the silence. But then life, as it always does, taught me otherwise. I remember sitting in my apartment after a particularly hard day, phone in hand, scrolling through contacts, searching for someone to call. Not because I needed to say anything important, but because I didn't want to sit alone with my thoughts. But then, something inside me whispered, what if you didn't run from this moment? What if you leaned into it? So I did. I put the phone down. I turned off the TV. I sat in the stillness and I listened to the hum of the city outside, to the quiet stirrings of my own heart. And what I found, there was not loneliness, but a strange, unexpected kind of peace. There's a beauty in learning to be alone. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need applause, the kind of confidence that doesn't require an audience. It's waking up in the morning and knowing that your worth is not dependent on anyone else. It's sitting in a cafe with no one across from you and not feeling incomplete. It's walking through a park and realizing that the trees, the sky, the air itself are company enough. Mr. Tanaka found that peace in his morning tea. I found it in a quiet apartment. Maybe you'll find it in the slow turning of a book's pages, in a long drive with no destination, in a solo walk where the world moves around you but asks nothing of you. We spend so much of our lives seeking belonging outside of ourselves, when all along, the deepest sense of home has been waiting for us within. So, if you find yourself alone more often these days, don't rush to fill the silence. Don't reach for your phone the second discomfort arises. Sit with it. Breathe into it. Get to know yourself in that space. You might just be surprised by the person you find there. Because in the end, peace is not something we search for in others. It's something we discover in ourselves. And when you find it, truly find it, you'll never feel lonely again. I remember the first time I truly understood what it meant to stand alone. Not in the dramatic sense of isolation or abandonment, but in the quiet realization that my happiness, my worth, my entire sense of self, none of it needed to rely on anyone else. It was a realization that didn't come easily. It arrived in fragments, through moments of discomfort, through seasons of solitude, and, ultimately, through the profound liberation of self-reliance. For most of my life, I had been conditioned to believe that my value was tied to my relationships. The number of people who called me a friend, the invitations I received, the reassurance of knowing that I belonged somewhere. It was a belief that shaped the way I navigated the world. Always seeking, always reaching, always making sure I was seen. But then, life, in its infinite wisdom, began to teach me a different lesson. There was a period when I found myself alone more often than I expected. Not by choice at first, but by circumstance. People moved away, relationships faded, and the once busy rhythm of my life slowed to a quiet hum. At first, it unsettled me. I filled the silence with distractions, grasping for anything that would remind me I was still connected. But the more I resisted, the more life seemed to nudge me toward something deeper. One evening, I stumbled upon the story of Li Wei, a Zen painter from China. In his youth, he was celebrated, admired, constantly surrounded by admirers who sought his wisdom and artistry. But as he grew older, he withdrew into solitude, choosing to live in the quiet embrace of nature. His friends worried. Was he lonely? Had he given up on the world? When asked, he simply replied, "When I was young, I feared being alone. But in my solitude, I found my greatest masterpiece. Peace within myself." That quote lingered in my mind, challenged me. Could solitude be a gift rather than a burden? Could self-reliance be a path to something greater, rather than a sign of loss? I decided to stop resisting the quiet. Instead of filling every empty space with noise, I let myself sit in it. I went to cafes alone, not to bury myself in a book or my phone, but to simply be. I took long walks with no destination, allowing my thoughts to unfold without distraction. I learned to enjoy the stillness of mornings, sipping coffee without the rush of a to-do list. And somewhere along the way, a shift happened. The more comfortable I became with myself, the more I realized how much of my life had been dictated by external validation. How many choices I had made based on what others expected, rather than what I truly wanted. How often I had stayed in situations that no longer served me, simply because I feared the alternative. Standing alone. There's something deeply liberating about realizing that you are enough. just as you are. That your worth is not contingent on the approval of others. That your happiness does not depend on being constantly surrounded by people. It doesn't mean rejecting relationships or isolating yourself from the world. It means engaging with life from a place of wholeness rather than need. This is a lesson that many great thinkers, artists, and leaders have understood. Take Leonardo da Vinci, for example. A man of immeasurable genius, he spent countless hours alone, sketching, dreaming, thinking. His solitude was not loneliness. It was the space where his greatest ideas were born. Or consider Maya Angelou, who once wrote, "I belong to myself. I am very proud of that. I am very concerned about how I look at Maya. I like Maya very much." These were people who did not wait for the world to affirm them. They did not seek permission to be who they were. They owned their solitude, and in doing so, they created something extraordinary. The truth is, when we become self-reliant, our relationships actually become richer, because we no longer approach them from a place of desperation. We don't seek companionship to fill a void. We seek it to share our fullness. We engage with others because we choose to, not because we need to, and that choice makes all the difference. I think about Li Wei often now. I imagine him in his quiet studio, painting with no audience, no accolades, just the pure joy of creation. I think about the people in my own life who have embraced solitude and found something beautiful within it. And I think about my own journey, how far I've come from that person who once feared being alone. So if you find yourself in a season of solitude, don't rush to escape it. Don't see it as something to be fixed or filled. Sit with it. Lean into it. Let it teach you what it has taught so many before you, that you are enough all on your own, that your worth is not something to be measured by the company you keep, but by the peace you cultivate within yourself. Because when you stop fearing solitude, when you embrace self-reliance, you unlock something rare and powerful. The kind of freedom that no one can take away from you. 3. Quality over quantity. The art of meaningful connections. I used to think that the more friends I had, the better my life would be. In my younger years, I would pack my weekends with social gatherings, dinner parties, and endless coffee dates, afraid that saying no would mean missing out. My phone buzzed constantly with group chats, invitations, and updates, and I felt important, needed even. But as the years passed, something shifted. I started to notice that in a room full of people, I often felt lonelier than when I was by myself. First, I ignored it. I told myself that this was just a passing phase, that I was tired, that I needed to make more of an effort. But the truth was, I was craving something different. I didn't just want conversations. I wanted connection. I didn't want to just be around people. I wanted to be seen. And that's when I realized, depth is more valuable than breadth. There's a saying in Zen Buddhism, when drinking tea, just drink tea. It's a simple instruction, yet profoundly wise. It means to be fully present in whatever you do. And if you apply it to relationships, it means that when you are with someone, truly be with them. No distractions, no small talk just for the sake of filling silence. No checking your phone in between sentences. Just presence. I remember a dinner I had with an old friend years ago. It wasn't extravagant. Just a small table at a quiet restaurant. But something about that evening stayed with me. We weren't in a rush. There was no pressure to be entertaining, no need to impress. We simply talked, and more importantly, we listened to each other. Contrast that with another night. A party filled with laughter, music, and a sea of familiar faces. On the surface, it should have been a great time. But looking back, I can't recall a single meaningful conversation from that night. We talked, yes, but we didn't connect. As I got older, I started to see relationships differently. It wasn't about how many friends I had. It was about the few who truly mattered. The ones who would sit with me in silence and not feel the need to fill it. The ones who would hear what I wasn't saying. The ones who didn't just celebrate my highs but walked with me through my lows. This realization led me to make some difficult choices. I stopped saying yes to every invitation. I let go of friendships that had run their course. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the role they had played in my life. I started investing my time and energy into the people who truly added value to my life. And in doing so, I found that my connections became richer, more meaningful. There's a misconception that letting go of friendships means losing something, but I've found the opposite to be true. By choosing quality over quantity, you don't end up with less. You end up with more. More depth, more trust, more moments that actually matter. Look at some of the most influential figures in history. Albert Einstein, despite his fame, had only a handful of close friends, and he cherished them deeply. Maya Angelou, a woman of great wisdom and warmth, once said, "A friend may be waiting behind a stranger's face." She understood that friendships aren't about numbers. They're about impact. Even Steve Jobs, known for his intensity, had only a small circle of people he truly trusted. He once remarked that simplicity was the key to brilliance, and I believe the same is true for relationships. The more we simplify our social lives, removing the unnecessary, focusing on the meaningful, the more fulfilling they become. I think about the relationships I value most now, and they all have one thing in common: presence. Whether it's a friend I see only once a year or a person I talk to every week, what matters is how we show up for each other. The best conversations are not the longest ones, but the ones where you feel truly heard. So, if you find yourself surrounded by people yet feeling disconnected, perhaps it's time to pause. Ask yourself, who in your life truly sees you? Who do you feel most at peace with? Who do you leave feeling lighter, not drained? And more importantly, are you that person for someone else? Life is too short for surface-level connections. Choose depth. Choose meaning. Choose the kind of friendships that make your soul feel at home. 4. The beauty of solitude, a path to inner wisdom. There was a time in my life when I feared being alone. Not just the physical solitude of an empty room or a quiet evening, but the deeper kind. The solitude of sitting with myself, with nothing to distract me from my own thoughts. I filled every moment with noise. Conversations, music, endless scrolling through my phone. Silence felt like an uncomfortable void, something to be avoided at all costs. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One summer, after a particularly difficult year filled with transitions, I found myself in a small cabin in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It wasn't an intentional retreat. It was more of an escape, a desperate need to step away from everything familiar. The first night, the silence was overwhelming. I could hear every creak of the trees, every shift of the wind. Without the hum of city life to drown it out, my mind felt unbearably loud. I sat by the window, staring into the darkness, wondering if I had made a mistake. But then, something changed. As the days passed, I began to notice things I had never paid attention to before. The way the morning light softened the edges of the world. The rhythmic tapping of rain against the roof. The sensation of breathing deeply, fully, without rush. And then, I noticed something even more unexpected. I began to hear my own thoughts in a way I never had before. Not the surface-level chatter of daily worries, but the deeper, quieter voice underneath. The one that had been drowned out for years by the constant noise of the world. That was when I understood what solitude truly meant. It wasn't about loneliness. It wasn't about isolation. It was about presence. So many of the great thinkers and spiritual leaders of history understood this long before I did. The Buddha sought enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, retreating from the distractions of the world. Henry David Thoreau spent years alone by Walden Pond, reflecting on life's simplest truths. Even Albert Einstein, in the midst of his groundbreaking discoveries, would take long solitary walks to let his mind wander freely. Solitude was not their burden. It was their sanctuary. There's an old Zen story about a monk who lived in a bamboo forest. A traveler once visited him and asked, "Aren't you lonely out here?" The monk simply smiled and said, "Loneliness is the absence of self-awareness. In solitude, I have found infinite companionship. With nature, with the present moment, with myself." I think about that story often. We live in a world that tells us that being alone is something to be fixed. That if you're not constantly surrounded by people, constantly engaged, then something must be missing. But what if solitude isn't a sign of lack, but a doorway to something greater? When you allow yourself to sit in the stillness, something incredible happens. You begin to see yourself more clearly. You begin to understand what truly matters to you, beyond the expectations and noise of the outside world. You become your own best company. After my time in the cabin, I started to embrace solitude in a way I never had before. I stopped fearing quiet moments. I learned to appreciate solo walks, solo meals, solo trips. I found joy in sitting alone in a park, watching the world move around me without feeling the need to be a part of it. And in doing so, I realized that the relationships I had, with friends, with family, became even richer, because I was no longer seeking people to complete me. I was simply sharing the fullness I had already found within myself. Maya Angelou once wrote, "I belong to myself. I am very proud of that." It's a simple statement, but a powerful one. To belong to yourself, to be at peace in your own presence, is one of the greatest freedoms you can have. If you're reading this and you find yourself uncomfortable with solitude, I encourage you to lean into it. Spend time alone, not as a punishment, but as a practice. Take yourself on a walk without your phone. Sit in a quiet room and just breathe. Pay attention to what arises when the distractions fall away. You might just find that, beneath all the noise, there is a version of you waiting to be heard. Because solitude is not emptiness. It is space. Space for growth, for clarity, for a deeper connection to life itself. And once you find comfort in your own company, you will never truly feel alone again. 5. The role of family and community. There was a time when I believed strength meant standing alone. I prided myself on my independence, on my ability to handle everything on my own without asking for help. I thought needing others was a weakness, a sign that I wasn't strong enough to carry the weight of my own life. But life has a way of humbling us, of teaching us lessons we never expected to learn. And for me, that lesson came in the form of a conversation with my grandmother. She was a small woman, but she carried the weight of generations in her presence. Her hands, worn and weathered, told stories of a life spent working, loving, and sacrificing. She had lived through wars, through loss, through change that reshaped everything she knew. And yet, she remained steady, like an old tree rooted deeply in the earth. One afternoon, as we sat together in the shade of her porch, she looked at me and said, "You think being strong means doing everything alone, but real strength? It comes from knowing you don't have to." At the time, I brushed it off, too caught up in my own stubbornness to really listen. But as the years passed, her words echoed in my mind, growing louder each time life proved her right. I began to realize that no matter how capable we are, no matter how much we think we can handle, we were never meant to go through this life alone. We are wired for connection, for shared experiences, for the give and take that comes from being part of something bigger than ourselves. The world often glorifies independence, especially in Western culture. We celebrate the lone wolf, the self-made success, the idea that happiness is found in personal achievement. But the truth is, even the most brilliant minds, the most accomplished individuals, all stood on the shoulders of those who came before them. Einstein had his mentors. Steve Jobs had his team. Maya Angelou had a community of writers and thinkers who shaped her journey. In many cultures, especially in Asian traditions, elders are seen as living libraries of wisdom. Their role isn't just to exist quietly in the background, but to guide, to teach, to pass down the lessons life has given them. In Japan, there's a deep respect for the elderly, an understanding that their knowledge is a resource, not a burden. In many indigenous communities, elders are the keepers of stories, the ones who ensure that wisdom isn't lost with time. I think about this often when I reflect on my grandmother's words. She wasn't just telling me that I didn't have to do everything alone. She was reminding me that we aren't meant to, that strength is found in leaning on others just as much as it is in standing firm on our own. I remember hearing the story of a Buddhist monk who lived in solitude for many years. When he returned to his village, people asked if he had found enlightenment. He smiled and said, "I found wisdom in solitude, but I found love in community." And what is wisdom without love? That stuck with me, because while solitude is a beautiful teacher, community is where we put those lessons into practice. It's where we learn patience, where we experience empathy, where we understand what it truly means to give without expectation. I saw this firsthand when a close friend of mine went through a difficult time. He had always been the type to handle things on his own, rarely opening up about his struggles. But when life hit him harder than he could manage, something changed. He let people in. He allowed his friends to support him, to carry some of the weight he had always kept to himself. And in doing so, he didn't just find comfort. He found healing. There is something profoundly humbling about realizing that we are all connected, that the struggles we carry are lighter when shared, that the wisdom we gain means little if we don't pass it on. Being part of a community isn't about clinging to relationships out of fear or obligation. It's about offering what we have, our presence, our experience, our understanding, in a way that enriches those around us. In the end, the legacy we leave behind isn't in the things we accumulate, but in the lives we touch, in the moments we show up for others, in the lessons we share. And maybe, just maybe, that's what true strength really is. 6. Letting go of social expectations. For much of my life, I believed in a script I didn't write. It wasn't handed to me explicitly, but it was everywhere. In the casual remarks of teachers, the quiet expectations of family, the glossy images on magazine covers, and the perfectly curated lives on social media. It was a script that told me what success should look like, how relationships should function, and even what kind of person I should aspire to be. So I followed it. I chased achievement, thinking that if I checked off enough milestones, degrees, promotions, friendships, social status, I would feel fulfilled. I filled my calendar with plans, my home with things, my life with people. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel an ache, a quiet but persistent sense that something wasn't right. I ignored it at first, thinking that maybe I just hadn't achieved enough yet. Maybe I needed a bigger circle of friends, a more impressive title, a better version of myself. Maybe if I fit the mold just a little more perfectly, that restless feeling would go away. But it didn't. And then, one day, I stumbled upon a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh that stopped me in my tracks. Let go, and you will be free. Let go? But let go of what? At first, I didn't understand. Then life, as it often does, showed me. I remember sitting at a dinner party, surrounded by conversation and laughter, yet feeling completely disconnected. I was there, but I wasn't present. The conversations felt forced, the interactions surface level. I realized that I was sitting at a table full of people, not because I deeply connected with them, but because I thought I should be there. Because a version of me, the one shaped by societal expectations, believed that having a full social life meant having a meaningful one. But that night, for the first time, I asked myself, what if I walked away from this? What if I stopped chasing relationships that didn't feel real? What if I let go of the idea that I needed to be liked, needed to be everywhere, needed to be everything to everyone? It was terrifying, but I did it. I started saying no to invitations that didn't bring me joy. I stopped keeping friendships alive just for the sake of nostalgia. I let go of the pressure to be constantly social, constantly available. At first, it felt like I was unraveling a life I had spent years constructing. But then, something remarkable happened. In the space that was left, something new emerged. Peace. I discovered that solitude wasn't something to be feared, but something to be cherished. That depth in relationships mattered more than quantity. That my worth wasn't determined by how many people wanted me around, but by how fully I showed up for the ones that truly mattered. I think about this often when I reflect on the lives of great thinkers and artists, people who dared to step away from the crowd to carve their own paths. Take Vincent van Gogh. During his lifetime, he was largely misunderstood, his work dismissed. He wasn't surrounded by admirers, wasn't celebrated as a genius. He lived much of his life in solitude, battling inner demons, painting relentlessly, not for approval, but because it was his truth. And now, his art moves people across generations, not because he sought validation, but because he let go of needing it. Or consider Emily Dickinson, who withdrew from society not out of fear, but because she found something richer in her inner world. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems, most of which were never published in her lifetime. But she wasn't writing for recognition. She was writing because she had to, because her deepest truth wasn't in following the world's expectations, but in following her own. These are extreme examples, of course. Most of us won't retreat into artistic solitude or abandon society entirely, but we can take something from them. We can choose to step off the treadmill of constant approval seeking. We can stop measuring our worth by the number of people in our lives, the size of our audience, the approval of the world. We can allow ourselves to live in a way that feels true, not performative. Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from attachment. Attachment to ideas, to identities, to the expectations placed upon us. And yet, when we release those attachments, what remains is something lighter, something freer. Letting go of social expectations doesn't mean rejecting community, but it means choosing it intentionally. It means valuing real connection over obligatory interaction. It means understanding that solitude is not failure, but a sacred space where we learn who we really are. So, if you've ever felt that quiet ache, the one that whispers that you are stretching yourself too thin, that you are playing a role that no longer fits, listen to it. Dare to step back. Dare to sit in the quiet. Dare to live on your own terms. And when you do, you just might find what I found. Freedom. 7. Redefining connection in old age. There's a certain quiet that comes with aging, a shift that happens so slowly we don't even notice it at first. The once busy calendar filled with social gatherings begins to empty. The phone, once ringing with invitations and plans, grows silent. The people who once surrounded us, colleagues, old friends, even family, start drifting away, pulled in different directions by the currents of their own lives. For some, this quiet feels like a loss, like something has been taken away. But for others, it becomes something else entirely. A kind of invitation, a chance to redefine what connection truly means. I remember visiting my grandfather a few years ago. He had always been a social man, the kind of person who thrived in the company of others. He could light up a room with a story, charm a stranger into becoming a friend. But as the years passed, the large gatherings grew fewer, the familiar faces became distant. I worried about how he was handling it. One evening, as we sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the trees, I asked him, "Do you ever feel lonely?" He smiled, shook his head, and pointed to the garden in front of us. "You see those flowers?" he said. "Every morning, I come out here and water them. I check on them, see which ones need more sunlight, which ones need to be trimmed. And when I do, I feel connected. Not just to the plants, but to the earth, to time itself." I didn't understand it then, but the older I get, the more I see what he meant. Connection isn't just about being surrounded by people. It's about presence. It's about how we show up, not just how often. There's a reason why some of the greatest minds in history, writers, monks, philosophers, have spoken about the power of solitude. Henry David Thoreau retreated to Walden Pond not because he wanted to be alone, but because he wanted to listen more deeply. The Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, not with a crowd, but in stillness, where he found enlightenment. And yet, solitude does not mean disconnection. It simply changes the way we define it. One of the most beautiful examples of this comes from Maya Angelou. She had a deep, lifelong friendship with Oprah Winfrey, but their connection was never about constant presence. It was about deep understanding, about moments of profound conversation, about a love that didn't require proximity to remain strong. As we age, our relationships evolve, but that doesn't mean they lose their meaning. We may not go to as many parties, but we can still have conversations that nourish the soul. We may not meet friends every day, but we can write letters, send messages, share a story over the phone. We may not be able to travel far, but we can sit with a cup of tea, look out the window, and feel a sense of connection to the world simply by noticing its quiet beauty. I once read about a woman named Alice, who, in her 70s, took up the habit of writing letters to strangers. She would send notes to people in hospitals, to young students, to anyone who might need a kind word. She said it made her feel more connected than she ever had before. Because connection isn't about how many people you interact with. It's about how deeply you engage with the moments you're given. A simple walk in nature, feeling the ground beneath your feet, the wind against your skin. This is connection. A handwritten letter, with words chosen carefully, knowing that someone miles away will hold it in their hands. This is connection. A conversation over the phone, where you truly listen, where you are there even if you are miles apart. This is connection. So, if you find yourself in a season of life where the rooms are quieter, where the invitations have slowed, know this: you are not alone. The world is still speaking to you, still offering you ways to feel part of something greater. You just have to redefine what connection looks like. And when you do, you might find that it was never about the number of people around you, but about the depth of presence within you. 8. Leaving a legacy of wisdom. There's a story I once heard about a man who planted a tree knowing he would never sit in its shade. When asked why, he simply smiled and said, "Because someone else will." That story has stayed with me for years, lingering in my thoughts whenever I think about the kind of legacy we leave behind. Society tells us that a legacy is about wealth, about achievements, about having our names etched into history. But the older I get, the more I realize that the most powerful legacies are not written in stone. They are carried in hearts. I think about my grandmother often. She was not a woman of riches or titles, yet she left behind something far more valuable than any material possession: wisdom. She never sat me down for formal lessons, never gave long speeches about life. Instead, she taught me through the simplest of moments. The way she greeted the morning with gratitude, the way she treated strangers with kindness, the way she never let life's hardships make her bitter. One day, when I was young and impatient, she said to me, "Everything you do leaves a mark on the world. Choose carefully what kind of mark you want to leave." At the time, I didn't fully understand, but I do now. We often underestimate the power of small moments. A kind word to a stranger, a lesson passed down to a child, the way we choose to show up in someone's life, even when they don't ask. These are the things that ripple outward, the things that live on long after we are gone. Take Maya Angelou, for example. She didn't just leave behind books. She left behind a way of seeing the world. She showed us that words have power, that stories can heal, that wisdom is meant to be shared. Or look at Fred Rogers, who spent his life reminding children and adults that kindness is the strongest force we have. Their legacies are not just in what they created, but in how they made people feel. Buddhism teaches that the greatest gift we can leave behind is not wealth, but wisdom. Because wisdom, unlike money or possessions, does not diminish when given. It multiplies. I once knew a man named Joseph. He was a teacher, but not in the traditional sense. He never stood in front of a classroom or held a degree, but he had a way of making people see the world differently. He worked as a janitor at a community center, quietly observing, quietly listening. When young people came to him with worries, he would smile and tell them stories, offering wisdom not as answers, but as questions that made them think. After he passed, people came forward with stories of how he had changed their lives. Not through grand gestures, not through wealth, but through simple conversations that shifted the way they saw themselves. That's the thing about wisdom. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be grand. It just needs to be shared. The question is, what are we sharing? What kind of wisdom are we passing down, intentionally or not? I used to think about legacy as something distant, something to worry about later. But the truth is, we are creating it now in the way we speak, the way we treat others, the way we move through the world. It's in the patience we show a child, in the encouragement we give a friend, in the kindness we offer to someone who may never return it. We will all leave something behind, not in the things we own, but in the lives we touch. So maybe the best question we can ask ourselves isn't what will I leave behind, but who will I lift up? Because in the end, the greatest legacy is not what we build, but what we give away. So, dear friends, I leave you with this. Solitude is not a void. It is a vast, open space where we can finally hear ourselves think, feel, and be. What does solitude mean to you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this message meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings so we can continue exploring these profound truths together. And remember, you are never truly alone. You are always in the presence of your own soul. Until next time, may you walk your path with peace and light. This structure ensures that the video is engaging, introspective, and deeply impactful while naturally guiding the audience towards self-reflection and action. Let me know if you'd like any refinements